Everyone in my family thought I had the perfect life. And honestly, standing in the lobby of the Fairmont Chateau Frontenac on my 30th birthday, surrounded by crystal chandeliers and women in gowns that cost more than my first car, I understood why they thought that. What they didn't know, what no one knew, was that I had spent the last 4 years feeling like a guest in my own marriage, tolerated, observed, quietly managed. My mother-in-law had a gift for making you feel small in ways that left no marks. Her name was Estelle. She was 71 years old, born in Westmount, educated in Switzerland, and she had never once in her life apologized for anything. She wore her hair silver and swept back, always. And she had this way of looking at you, a slow measuring look, like she was calculating exactly how much you were worth and coming up short. She had done it to me the first time I met her at a dinner in Old Quebec City, and she had been doing it ever since. My husband Tristan was her youngest son. He was kind when we were alone. That's the thing I kept coming back to, even at the end. When it was just the two of us, Saturday mornings with coffee on the balcony of our condo in the plateau, or long drives out to the eastern townships in October when the maples were burning red, he was the man I fell in love with. Thoughtful, funny, the kind of person who remembered small things, like how you take your tea, or which song you were listening to when something important happened. But the moment his mother was in the room, he disappeared. Not physically, he was still there, holding his wine glass, nodding along. But whoever he was when we were alone, that version of him packed up and left without a word, and what remained was someone I barely recognized. Deferential. Careful. A man who chose every word like he was diffusing something. I noticed it on our honeymoon. I noticed it at Christmas. I noticed it at the quarterly dinners Estelle hosted at her house in Mont-Tremblant, where the table sat 14 and the conversation was always somehow about her. I told myself it was just a difficult family dynamic. I told myself lots of things. The first year of our marriage, Estelle told me, very gently, very warmly, that perhaps I should consider transitioning out of my position at the architecture firm where I worked. She framed it as generosity. The Beaumont family had connections, she said. Opportunities. There was a foundation she chaired, and she thought I might find it more fulfilling than billing hours. What she meant, I understood later, was that a woman with her own income and her own professional identity was harder to control. I didn't leave the firm. That was the beginning of what she called my stubbornness, though she never used that word directly. She used phrases like your independent streak or the way you tend to hold on to things. Always said with a smile, always in front of other people, so I couldn't respond without seeming difficult. The second year, she started working on Tristan more seriously. I could see it happening, but I didn't know how to stop it. He started coming home quieter. He started second-guessing decisions we had made together, where we would spend the holidays, whether we were ready to buy a house, whether I was really happy in my career or just telling myself I was. These were Estelle's questions. I recognized her syntax in his mouth. By the third year, I had started keeping notes. Not because I had a plan. I want to be honest about that. I wasn't strategic yet. I was just trying to stay sane. I wrote down the things she said and the things she did because putting them on paper made me feel less like I was imagining it all. Tristan would sometimes tell me I was being sensitive, and when he said it, he looked uncertain, like he wasn't sure whose words those were either. I brought it up with our family doctor once, in passing, the way you bring up things you're not quite ready to say out loud. She was a quiet woman, practical, with an office on Sherbrooke Street, and she listened to me describe my husband's changed behavior, the mood shifts, the withdrawal, the way he sometimes looked at me like he was trying to remember something he'd been told to forget, and she said something I carried with me for a long time afterward. She said, sometimes when people change that consistently and that specifically, it's worth asking what's staying the same. What was staying the same was Estelle. And the lunches. Every Wednesday, without exception, Tristan had lunch with his mother. He'd come home afterward quieter, more distant. I had always assumed it was just their relationship, the particular gravity some mothers have over their children, the weight of expectation and old love pulling everything back to the center. It was my colleague at the firm, a woman named Daphne, who had done some pro bono work with a family law organization in Gatineau, who first said the word I hadn't let myself think. We were having coffee in the break room on a Tuesday afternoon. I had said something vague about Tristan seeming off, and she had asked a few careful questions, and then she had set down her mug and said, "Has anyone actually checked what he's eating at those lunches?" I looked at her. She said, "I'm not being dramatic. I've seen this. Certain compounds, not illegal, not hard to obtain if you know where to look. They don't sedate. They just make someone more malleable, more suggestible. Over time." She paused. "It sounds like a thriller, but it isn't." I drove home that night with my hands very steady on the wheel and my mind completely silent, the way it gets when something you've known but refused to name finally comes into focus. I called my cousin the next morning. His name is Philippe, and he works as an investigator with a financial crimes unit in Ottawa, not RCMP, a private firm contracted by federal agencies, the kind of work he can't talk much about at family dinners, which means I know enough to know he's good at it. I told him what I suspected. I told him about the Beaumont family's business holdings, the foundation Estelle ran, the property transfers I had noticed in documents Tristan had brought home and left on his desk, the ones he didn't know I'd seen. Philippe was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Send me everything you have." I spent 3 weeks building what he needed. I was careful. I didn't touch anything in Tristan's study that I hadn't already touched. I took photographs, not originals. I documented dates and amounts and cross-referenced them with public filings from the Registraire des Entreprises de Quebec. I'm an architect. I know how to read a site plan, how to follow a structure from foundation to roofline. Financial documents, I came to understand, work the same way. Everything has a load-bearing wall. You find it and the rest reveals itself. What I found was significant. There were numbered companies registered in New Brunswick with no apparent business activity, receiving transfers from the Foundation's operating account. There were property transactions in the Laurentians recorded at values that didn't match the assessments. There were payments to a medical consulting firm in Laval that, as far as I could tell, had no other clients, no website, and a registered address that turned out to be a mailbox on CRA Le Boller Boulevard. Philippe took it to his contacts at the CRA's Special Enforcement Program. They were interested. It took another 2 months before anything moved. During those 2 months, I kept going to work. I kept coming home. I kept sitting across from Tristan at dinner and asking about his day and listening to him answer with a kind of careful vagueness that I now understood differently. I was no longer frightened by the distance between us. I was grieving it. That's different. Grief doesn't panic. Grief just sits with what's true. Estelle had planned my birthday celebration. This was her gesture, her annual demonstration that she was a generous and loving mother-in-law, and I had never once been permitted to refuse it. 30 was going to be significant, she announced. The Chateau Frontenac, a private dining room. 60 guests, it would be beautiful. I let her plan it. I even helped a little. Sent a guest list when she asked. I added 2 names she wouldn't recognize. The dinner was a Saturday in late November. I remember the drive from Montreal to Quebec City, 4 hours in light snow, Tristan at the wheel, the radio playing something low and instrumental. He was in a quiet mood. He'd been to his mother's for lunch the day before, a Friday, which was unusual, and he had come home with that particular blankness in his eyes that I had stopped trying to interpret and started simply noting. I wore a dress I had bought myself. Deep green, structured at the shoulder, nothing Estelle would have chosen for me. She had sent something to the condo the week before. Ivory, draped, forgiving. The kind of dress you wear when someone else is deciding who you are. I had left it on the chair in the guest room and not mentioned it. When she saw me in the green dress, something moved across her face very quickly and then disappeared. She kissed my cheeks. She said I looked lovely. She said it the way you say a thing when you mean its opposite. The dinner was everything she had intended. The room was warm, the wine was excellent, the table settings were perfect. Estelle moved through the room with the ease of someone who has never questioned whether she belongs. She made a toast. She spoke about family, about legacy, about the gift of welcoming new people into a circle that had stood for generations. She looked at me when she said, "new people." I smiled. I was good at smiling by then. 4 years of practice. The moment came between the main course and dessert. I saw it building the way you see weather coming in off the St. Lawrence. A pressure change, a shift in the quality of light. Estelle had been speaking with her eldest son, Gilbert, near the windows, and whatever she said to him had sent him across the room to Tristan, and then Tristan was standing up, and then he was walking toward me. He didn't look like himself. He looked like a man carrying out instructions. He stood beside my chair. The conversation at the table had not quite stopped, but it had lowered, the way it does when people sense something is about to happen. Estelle was watching from the window. 60 people in the room, and the air was pulling tight. Tristan said in a voice I didn't recognize that I had been embarrassing him, that my attitude toward his family had been noted, that there were things we needed to discuss. He said it quietly, like it was reasonable, like he was doing something measured and appropriate. And then, before I had fully processed any of it, his hand came across and struck the side of my face. Not hard, that's the thing I keep returning to, even now. It wasn't hard. It was controlled. It was the kind of slap designed to not to injure but to humiliate, to land in front of 60 people and remind everyone, including me, of a particular order of things. The room went completely still. I felt the sting of it travel from my cheekbone up through my temple. I felt 60 pairs of eyes. I felt Estelle, across the room, watching with an expression that I can only describe as satisfaction, tempered with performance. She arranged her face into shock a half-second too late. I stood up. I don't know exactly what expression I was wearing. I know what I felt, not rage, not humiliation, not the urge to cry. What I felt was something almost like relief. The specific relief of a person who has been waiting for a thing to happen and finally, it has happened. Like a weather system breaking, like the pressure equalizing. I laughed. It came out of me before I could shape it into anything else. Not hysterical, not performed. A real laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere structural in your chest, and it surprised even me with how certain it sounded. Tristan stared at me. Estelle's expression shifted. I reached into my clutch and took out my phone. I had one message to send, and I had been holding that message in my drafts for 11 days. I sent it then, standing at that table with my cheek still warm, while 60 people watched me in silence. The message went to Philippe. I sat back down. I picked up my dessert fork. Across the table, a woman named Suzanne, the wife of one of Tristan's business partners, someone I had always liked, was looking at me with wide eyes, and I gave her a small nod that I hope communicated something like, "It's all right. It's already done." It took 19 minutes. I know, because I counted in that quiet and specific way you count things when you need to stay anchored. I ate my dessert. I answered when someone spoke to me. I watched Estelle move through the room, still hosting, still performing, her composure intact because she did not yet understand what was coming. The doors of the private dining room opened at 19 minutes past 9 in the evening. There were 4 of them, 2 from the CRA Special Enforcement Program, 1 from the Quebec Provincial Financial Intelligence Unit, and 1 I recognized from a conversation Philippe had described, a quiet man in a gray suit who had spent 8 years unraveling shell company structures in the Maritimes. They moved with the particular calm of people who have done this many times and feel no urgency because urgency has already been replaced by certainty. They asked for Estelle Beaumont-Therian by name. I watched her face from across the room. I watched the composure, that extraordinary practiced, decades-old composure, come apart, not all at once, in pieces, like something load-bearing giving way. She looked at me. I held her gaze. I didn't smile. I didn't look away. There was a conversation near the door that I couldn't fully hear. Then there were 2 of them walking with Estelle out of the room, her silver head still perfectly upright, because even then she could not stop performing. Gilbert followed, his phone already at his ear. Several other guests began to leave quickly, with the specific energy of people who have been in proximity to something and want to establish distance. Tristan hadn't moved. He was still standing near my chair, and the blankness had been replaced by something I hadn't seen on his face in years. Confusion, not performed confusion, real confusion, the kind that comes from a person waking up mid-sentence and not knowing how they got there. He looked at me. He looked at the door. He looked at his hand, the one he had used, like he was seeing it from outside himself. He said my name, just that, my name. I didn't answer right away. I thought about what my doctor had said, asking what stays the same. I thought about the medical consulting company in Laval with no clients and no website. I thought about 4 years of watching my husband disappear in increments and never knowing why. I said, "You need a doctor, a real one, not one your mother chose. Philippe can recommend someone. I've already asked him." He sat down in his chair. He looked like someone who had just surfaced from a very long dive. The following weeks were not simple. None of what came after was simple, and I want to be honest about that. Estelle was released on conditions. The investigation was moving. But these things take time in Canada, and she had resources and lawyers and a family name that still meant something in certain offices. Gilbert took over the foundation and spent the first month trying to reshape the narrative. There were articles in the Quebec press, framed carefully, source unclear. There were phone calls from Tristan's aunts and cousins that I didn't answer. Tristan went into a private treatment program in the Outaouais region, voluntary. His own choice, the first real choice, I think, that he had made in years. His doctor confirmed what I had suspected, a low-grade long-term exposure to compounds that his mother had arranged to have introduced into his food over a period that his physician described as, at minimum, 2 to 3 years. His neurologist called it a slow manipulation of biochemistry. His therapist called it abuse. I called it what it was. We were separated. I want to say that clearly because I know it's the part that's hardest to understand from the outside, that I could believe he was a victim and still choose, for the time being, to live separately. Those two things aren't contradictions. A person can deserve compassion and still require distance. Healing is not a thing I could do for him, and my own recovery was not something I could do while sleeping in the same house. I went back to work. I finished a project I had been carrying for 2 years, a community recreation center in Rouen-Noranda, and I drove up there in March, when the snow was still 4 feet deep, and stood in the space I had designed and felt, for the first time in a long time, like a person who was exactly where she was supposed to be. The CRA investigation moved forward. By spring, the charges had been formalized: tax fraud, breach of fiduciary duty in connection with the foundation, and a series of offenses relating to the numbered companies in New Brunswick. The property assessments in the Laurentians opened a separate line of inquiry involving a municipal official whose name I hadn't recognized when I first saw it in the documents, but which Philippe said meant something significant to people who followed that kind of thing. Estelle's lawyers argued that she was a woman of advanced age and fragile health who had spent her life in service to the community. The filings describing what she had done to her own son, her own youngest son, did not appear to enter their arguments as anything relevant. I thought about that a lot. On the evening the formal charges were announced, I was at my parents' house in Laval for dinner. My mother made tourtière, which is what she makes when she wants to communicate love without discussion. My father poured wine and we watched the Canadiens lose, and no one mentioned Estelle's name. After dinner, I sat on my parents' back porch and called Philippe. He answered on the second ring. I said, "Thank you." He said, "You did the work?" Which was true, but the work had been possible because someone had told me it was worth doing and had stayed on the phone at odd hours and had believed me when I described something that sounded, I know, like a screenplay. It doesn't sound like a screenplay anymore. What I know now is this: power that depends on silence is not power. It's a debt structure, borrowed authority, maintained through accumulated compliance, held together by the assumption that no one will ever add it all up. Estelle had run that structure for decades. The foundation, the family, my marriage, the Wednesday lunches. All of it required that the people being managed believed they were being loved. I believed it longer than I should have. I will say that plainly. I saw the signs and told myself I was misreading them, because the alternative, that the woman who sent birthday cards and planned anniversary dinners and kissed my cheeks at every departure, was deliberately, systematically dismantling my husband's ability to think for himself, was a thing I didn't want to be true. It was true. And the laugh, that night in the Chateau Frontenac, in front of 60 people in a private dining room while the snow came down outside and the St. Lawrence ran dark and cold below the city, that laugh was not performance. It was not defiance exactly. It was the sound of someone who had done the accounting and found that, finally, the numbers were going to come out right. Tristan called me on a Thursday afternoon in April from a payphone at a gas station outside Maniwaki because his phone had died and he'd been on a drive to clear his head. He said he had been thinking about a lot of things. He said he understood if the answer was no. He asked if I would be willing to have dinner sometime, somewhere quiet, somewhere that didn't belong to anyone in his family. I said I would think about it. I am still thinking about it. That's the most honest thing I can tell you. I don't have a clean ending. I have a woman who knows her own mind for the first time in 4 years, standing in a city she loves, with a career she built herself, breathing air that she is no longer sharing with something that was trying to diminish her. That is enough. For right now, that is more than enough. There's a moment I keep coming back to, not the slap, not the laugh, not the 4 investigators walking through those doors. It's the drive home from my parents' place in Laval, the night the charges were announced. Snow on the highway, the radio low, Torsiar still warm in my stomach. I remember thinking, this is what the other side feels like. Ordinary, quiet, mine. I spent a long time believing that enduring something patiently was the same as handling it well, that staying composed while Estelle rearranged my marriage around me was a kind of strength. It wasn't. It was just silence with better posture. Real strength, I've come to understand, is what you do with the information you're refusing to look at directly. It's the moment you stop reframing what you know and start asking what it actually means. That's the thing about living alongside manipulation for years. It doesn't announce itself. It arrives as concern, as tradition, as family loyalty, as Wednesday lunches that your husband comes home from a little quieter every time. By the time you name it, you've already spent years adjusting yourself around it, trimming the edges of your own instincts to fit a shape someone else decided you should occupy. The intelligence was always there. I had documented things without understanding why I needed to. I had noticed patterns without letting myself follow them to their conclusions. What changed wasn't what I knew, it was whether I was willing to trust it. And then there's what I did with that trust. Not revenge, exactly. I want to be precise about that. I didn't act out of anger, I acted out of accountability. There's a difference, and it matters. What Estelle built required that no one add it all up. The foundation, the numbered companies, the medical consulting firm with no clients on Cure Labella Boulevard, the steady biochemical erosion of her own son's ability to think for himself. Every piece of it depended on the assumption that the people closest to her would choose comfort over truth. I chose differently. And I chose it slowly, carefully, with documentation and patience and a cousin who answered his phone at odd hours. That's not revenge. That's just not looking away. What I grieve still is Tristan, not the version of him that stood beside my chair that night. I understand now that he was barely present in his own body. I grieve the Saturday mornings, the October drives, the man who remembered small things. He exists somewhere. I think he's finding his way back to himself, one session at a time in a treatment center outside Maniwaki. Whether there's a version of our story that continues, I genuinely don't know. What I know is that compassion for him and protection of myself are not competing values. I held both then. I hold both now. If there's anything I'd want someone else to take from all of this, it's that the 3 things that got me through were not extraordinary. They were just sustained. Knowing what was right and refusing to abandon it even when it was inconvenient. Thinking carefully and building a case rather than reacting. And staying in it. The long, unglamorous, document photographing, coffee in the break room, note-taking middle of it, when everything in me wanted to either explode or disappear. Estelle counted on my silence. She miscalculated who she was dealing with. That's the whole story, really. The rest is just evidence.